The Colorado River is one of the largest rivers in North America. For most of the last 60 years, it does not reach the ocean. It just stops. Somewhere in the desert, about 100 miles short of the Sea of Cortez, the water disappears into sand. Officials call this a drought story. Sun, climate, bad luck. I manage water systems for a living, and drought did not kill this river. A stack of paperwork killed it, decades before anyone called it a crisis. The same agreement that saved the American Southwest quietly wrote the ocean out of the deal. Okay, let me back up, because I don't want you to think this is a river that just quietly faded away one summer. That's not what happened here, and that's the part that bothers me professionally. I've spent my career around allocation systems, reservoirs, treaties, the boring paperwork side of water that nobody wants to read until the river stops showing up where it's supposed to. And this is the case I bring up when people assume infrastructure failures are always accidents. This one wasn't an accident. This one was arithmetic. And arithmetic is a lot harder to forgive than a storm, because a storm doesn't come with 7 signatures on it. Here's the visual, because I want you to actually see it. Fly along the river near Yuma, Arizona, and you can watch it happen in real time. The Colorado doesn't crash into a wall or get blocked by a dam right at the finish line. There's no dramatic concrete stop sign, no single villain moment. It just thins out. It splits into threads, like a frayed piece of yarn pulled apart at the ends. And by the time it should be nearing the Gulf of California, there's nothing left to fray. About 90% of the river's total flow is retained and diverted before it ever gets that far. Pulled off through canals, into cities and farmland across 2 countries. 90%. Sit with that number for a second, because that's not a leak. That's not somebody forgetting to close a valve at 2 in the morning. That's the system working exactly the way it was designed to work, on schedule, every single year, and calling that a drought is like blaming the weather for a bill you already paid somewhere else. And that's the first reversal, and it's the one that should unsettle you more than a broken pipe would. A broken pipe is a mistake. This is a plan. The question isn't what went wrong. The question is, who designed a river system that never accounted for the river needing to finish its own journey, and when did we all quietly decide that was an acceptable trade? So let's go back to where the paperwork actually starts, because this is where the case gets interesting. In 1922, 7 states signed the Colorado River Compact, splitting the river's water between an upper basin and a lower basin. This was decades before most of the dams that would eventually control the river even existed. Nobody was diverting the amounts being promised yet. It was all still theoretical, all still numbers on a page in a negotiating room, drawn up by men who had never once watched what this river does in a genuinely dry decade. And here's the professional detail that doesn't get repeated enough. The flow estimates they used to divide up the river were almost certainly measured during an unusually wet stretch of years. I don't have the precise year-by-year hydrology sitting in front of me, and I want to be careful not to hand you a number I can't defend on camera. But the broader pattern is well understood among people who study this basin. The compact promised more water on paper than the river reliably produces in an average year. You can't overdraw a bank account for 100 years and act shocked when the balance hits 0 at the far end. And where does the far end happen to be? The ocean. The one stakeholder in this entire negotiation with no seat at the table, no lawyer, no lobbyist, and no vote. Now, the dams. Hoover Dam goes up in 1935, and that starts reshaping how water moves downstream. But the real structural turning point, the one that actually silences the river's connection to the sea, is Glen Canyon Dam in the early 1960s. Before that dam's reservoir, Lake Powell, could start delivering water downstream the way it was designed to, it first had to fill. That's not a footnote. That's the mechanism. The delta didn't dry up gradually because of some slow-motion climate shift nobody could have anticipated. It dried up because a bathtub upstream needed to fill first. And nobody built in a plan for what happens to the last 100 miles of river while that's happening. That's the kind of detail that sounds like trivia until you realize it's the entire hinge the story turns on. Here's where I'd expect the story to just end. Quietly, sadly, case closed, tragedy of the commons, nothing more to see. Except it doesn't. And this is the part that really gets under my skin, because it proves the ecosystem down there wasn't gone. It was being withheld. By the late 1970s, the delta had deteriorated into a scattering of disconnected, dried-out habitat patches. Cracked earth where wetlands used to be, the kind of ground that swallows footprints instead of holding water. That's the official low point, the version that gets repeated in most summaries. But in the 1980s, and again in the 1990s, unusually heavy snowpack in the Rocky Mountains forced the dam operators to release water they had nowhere else to store. This wasn't intentional restoration. It was overflow. Excess nobody wanted to hold behind the dam. And when that water hit the delta almost by accident, the ecosystem came roaring back on its own, with almost no help from anyone, no restoration budget, no coalition, no press conference. The river physically reached the sea during flood years in the 1980s and again in 1993. Think about what that actually tells you. This wasn't a dead system that needed to be resurrected from scratch with new engineering and new species and new soil. This was a living system being starved on purpose by a management structure that simply never prioritized it, and that occasionally got overruled by weather doing what management refused to do. That's not drought killing a river. That's drought, ironically, being the only force generous enough to occasionally let the river behave like a river. Let's talk about who's actually pulling this water, because none of this is secret. It's not a cover-up in the conspiracy sense. It's contractual. And honestly, that's almost worse, because it means everyone in the room signed off on it in writing. Concrete canals move Colorado River water to Phoenix, to Tucson, to Los Angeles, to San Diego. Millions of people relying on a river most of them will never personally see or think about past their tap. Before the river even approaches the border, agricultural operations in places like the Imperial Valley are pulling heavily through infrastructure like the All-American Canal, feeding some of the most productive farmland in the country, the lettuce and the alfalfa, and the winter vegetables that end up in grocery stores 1,000 miles away. I don't have a precise current year diversion figure. I'm comfortable putting a number on here. That data shifts year to year, and I'd want to verify it against the most recent reporting before I hung a hard claim on it, but the scale isn't really in dispute among anyone who studies this system. This is not a scandal of theft. It's a scandal of design. Nobody broke the rules. The accountability question isn't who cheated the system. It's who wrote the rules in the first place and never left room for the river to finish what it started. Now here's a side branch, and I promise it connects back, because this is the part that shows you how thin the actual monitoring on this river has historically been. In 2007, researchers including Edward Glenn and Carl Flessa published a peer-reviewed rebuttal to a claim that flood flows reaching the delta don't actually make it to the Gulf at all, that they instead evaporate off into Laguna Salada, a below sea level lakebed sitting near the river's mouth. That claim, if true, would have handed everyone a convenient excuse. Why bother sending environmental water downstream if it just bakes off into a salt flat before it does anyone any good? Their findings push back hard on that idea. Only a small fraction of those flood flows were evaporating there. And more importantly, they found that freshwater pulses were measurably increasing shrimp populations downstream and expanding nursery habitat for Gulf corvina, a commercially important fish that needs that specific brackish estuarine mix of salt and fresh water during its early life stages. Here's why that scientific fight actually matters to you, the viewer, and not just to two academics arguing in a journal nobody outside the field reads. If credentialed scientists were still publicly disputing where the water physically goes as recently as the 2000s, that tells you the monitoring picture down there has been incomplete for a very long time. You cannot manage what you haven't fully measured. That's not a philosophical statement I'm making for effect. That's the actual professional standard I work under, and it was missing here for decades, which means a lot of the official story about this river was quietly built on partial data dressed up as certainty. Okay, so now we get to the part everyone actually remembers, if they remember any of this at all. The 2014 Pulse Flow. This is the headline event, the one that got magazine spreads and viral photos of families wading into a river their grandparents used to swim in, the moment this story usually gets flattened down into a tidy, happy ending. In November 2012, the United States and Mexico signed something called Minute 319, an amendment to the underlying 1944 water treaty between the two countries. Buried inside it was a commitment to deliver environmental flows specifically for the delta alongside a bunch of other, less photogenic provisions about surplus sharing and shortage rules during dry years. On March 23, 2014, the gates at Morelos Dam, right on the border, were opened. Over roughly 8 weeks, about 105,000 acre-feet of water, somewhere around 130 million cubic meters, moved down through the dried channel toward the delta. For the first time in more than 50 years, the river physically reached the sea again. People stood in it. Kids who had never seen the river as anything but a dry ditch got to wade into it, splash in it, treat it like the ordinary miracle it should have been all along. I want you to feel the actual size of that moment, because it was genuinely significant, genuinely emotional, and I'm not here to take that away from anyone who stood in that water. And then I want to hand you the detail that changes how you should feel about it professionally, the detail that turns celebration into something more complicated. The people releasing that water weren't entirely sure what it would do. Jennifer Pitt, who worked on Colorado River issues for the Environmental Defense Fund, said one of the primary goals of the pulse flow was literally to see how water behaves in that system. Read that again, slowly. The headline restoration event of the decade was, functionally, a controlled experiment, not a fix, a test. That's not restoration wearing its own clothes. That's a science experiment wearing a celebrations costume. And I don't say that to diminish what it accomplished, because it clearly did some real ecological good. I say it because we're not sure exactly what this will do is a very different sentence than we fixed it. And only one of those two sentences got printed on the magazine covers. This is the technology fit question I'd be asking as a professional. It's not whether releasing water into a dry riverbed is legitimate. Of course it is. The question is whether one short, deliberately experimental pulse, run once, was ever going to be enough to answer the actual long-term question, which is what a river this depleted needs on a permanent basis. A single test flow tells you how water behaves for 8 weeks. It does not tell you how to run a river for the next century. And here's the number that should really bother you, the one that undercuts the celebration entirely if you sit with it for more than 10 seconds. That pulse flow, the one being called historic, the one people were genuinely crying over, represented less than 1% of the river's total annual yield. Less than 1%. To make even that happen, a coalition of nonprofits called Raise the River had to raise $10 million just to meet the water purchase obligations required under the agreement. Read that sentence one more time. Private philanthropy was funding a river's right to occasionally finish reaching the ocean, because a treaty written in 1922 never allocated a single drop for it in the first place. That's not a conservation success story standing on its own. That's a symptom wearing a success story's outfit. When you need a charity fundraiser to buy back a fraction of a percent of a river's own water so it can occasionally touch its own delta, you don't have a solved problem. You have a rounding error dressed up as a headline, and the applause is real, but it's applauding the wrong line item. And it didn't hold. This is the monitoring gap part of the story, the part that doesn't get the magazine spread 5 years later. Following the 2014 pulse, small base flows continued trickling into the delta under the Minute 319 agreement, but the total delivered over its entire 5-year term, ending in 2017, added up to only about 57,000 acre-feet. That's the whole 5 years combined, not per year. A successor agreement, Minute 323, had to be signed in September 2017 just to keep the effort going at all, which tells you plainly that the original fix wasn't self-sustaining. It needed a sequel immediately, or the small gains would have simply reversed. And then there's the gap that really tells the story. After 2014, the river didn't reach the sea again in a comparable way until 2025, when roughly 35,000 acre-feet were delivered, this time deliberately routed through irrigation channels near the border to bypass a dry stretch of riverbed that had been swallowing water on its way south. 11 years between historic restorations, and even then, they had to engineer around the river's own broken middle section just to get water past it. If your fix needs to be redeclared historic every decade with a fresh press release, it was never actually a fix. It was a heartbeat monitor, not a cure, and heartbeat monitors don't heal anything by themselves. They just tell you the patient is still, technically, alive. To be fair, because I want to be fair here, that 2025 release did measurable good. Bird abundance in the delta rose by roughly 20%, and the diversity of species observed increased by more than 40%, which is the kind of number that should genuinely make you feel something. It shows the underlying biology down there is still intact, still ready to respond. The second real water shows up, the way a dormant seed responds to rain, it wasn't sure it was coming. That's actually the most hopeful fact in this entire story. But hopeful and solved are not the same word, and I need you to hold both of those at once, because that's what honest water management actually looks like in the real world. It's rarely a clean win. It's usually a partial one, with an asterisk attached to it, and the asterisk is where the actual story lives. And it's not just symbolic on the ground. There are real communities and real ecosystems riding on whatever gets negotiated in these binational meetings every few years, on a schedule set by diplomats, not by rainfall. Indigenous Kukapa communities who have lived along this river for generations, residents of the Mexicali Valley who watch the flow rise and fall with treaty renewals, migratory bird corridors that depend on the delta's brackish marshes as a stopover, commercial shrimp and corvina fisheries downstream that need exactly the kind of estuarine mixing those researchers were arguing about back in 2007. None of that is guaranteed by permanent law. All of it depends on whether the next diplomatic minute gets signed on schedule, whether the next NGO fundraiser hits its target, whether the next snowpack year up in the Rockies happens to be generous enough to force the dam operator's hand the way it did, almost by accident, in the 80s and 90s. That is an extraordinarily fragile way to keep an ecosystem, and the people tied to it, alive. You wouldn't run a hospital that way. You wouldn't run a power grid that way, waiting for a lucky winter to keep the lights on. But somehow, it's how we've run the last 100 miles of one of the most important rivers on the continent for as long as anyone alive today has been watching. So what would a competent water manager have done differently if you could rewind the tape all the way back to 1922? Honestly, probably not what you're picturing. I don't think the answer is some perfect utopian allocation where nobody in Phoenix or the Imperial Valley gets water anymore. That's not how any of these systems actually work in practice, and pretending otherwise isn't useful to anyone, least of all the river. The actual standard of care failure is simpler than that, and more damning. You do not build a permanent allocation system around temporary, unusually generous hydrology, and then just hope the terminus of the river sorts itself out later. On borrowed snowpack you can't control or predict. You reserve water for the system's own basic function, its own plumbing, before you divide up the surplus among everyone with a claim on it. That's not radical thinking. That's just how you're supposed to manage a shared resource you didn't create and don't fully control. The Colorado River Compact solved a very real 1920s political problem. 7 states fighting over who gets what, share of a river, none of them fully understood yet. But it solved that political problem by treating the river itself, the actual physical, biological, ocean-reaching river, as an afterthought to be dealt with later, if ever, by somebody else's grandchildren. And once you build the legal architecture that way, every dam and every canal that comes after it is just following instructions. It was handed a century ago, faithfully, to the letter. That's the thing I keep coming back to, the thing I want you to leave with. This wasn't a mysterious environmental surprise that ambushed a bunch of well-meaning engineers who had no way of knowing better. It was the fully predictable output of a treaty that never left room for the ending, dams built to faithfully fulfill that treaty's promises, and a management culture that treats the Delta as a bonus round instead of a baseline requirement. Every twist in this story, the wet year allocation math that overpromised from day one, the dam filling delay that structurally silenced the river, the accidental flood year revivals that proved the ecosystem was starved and not dead, the scientific dispute over where the water actually goes, the pulse flow that turned out to be a quiet experiment, the historic release that was less than 1% of the river, all of it points back to the exact same root mistake, over and over, wearing a different costume each time. Politics before hydrology, procurement before diagnosis, a press release before a plan. Picture the actual endpoint for a second, because I think most people picture this wrong. They imagine a river just weakly dribbling into the ocean, thin but present. That's not what's down there. What's down there, most years, is a cracked, sun-baked mudflat where a river mouth used to be, salt crusted into geometric patterns on ground that hasn't held real fresh water in longer than most of the people watching this have been alive. Birds still pass through because birds don't read hydrology reports, they just follow habitat wherever it flickers back on. Fishing families downstream still remember boats that used to work water that isn't there anymore. That's the actual texture of this failure. It's not abstract. It's a specific, physical, photographable place that used to be alive on a scheduled nature set and is now alive only on a scheduled diplomat set. And here's a detail that's easy to skip past, but shouldn't be. The sun down there is not going anywhere. The heat has not been renegotiated. Every calculation this system runs, evaporation off open canals, off Lake Mead, off Lake Powell, happens under the same brutal desert sun that was already baking this basin in 1922. Nobody accounted for how much of the promised water simply evaporates in transit before it ever reaches a faucet or a field, let alone a delta. That's not a footnote either. That's water lost to physics, not to any user. And it was underestimated from the start, the same way the wet year flow numbers were overestimated from the start. Two errors in the same direction, both making the promised total look bigger than the real total, and both landing hardest on whoever's at the far end of the line. The delta is still about 100 miles short of whole. The canals are still open, moving the same 90% they always have, on the same century-old paperwork nobody has fundamentally rewritten. The next headline-grabbing pulse flow, whenever it comes, will still be an experiment funded by donations and diplomacy, not something guaranteed by the actual law governing the river. Nothing about the underlying physical situation has changed since 1922. The water still behaves exactly like water always has, obeying gravity and contracts in equal measure. It goes wherever the paperwork sends it, and right now, on paper, that paperwork still doesn't send it to the ocean. The ocean isn't missing. It's just not on anyone's water bill.